Sustainability gap address, and it will be a 7th pitch, Team Evergreen.
Is that coming through all right? I'm fighting a bit of a cold today, so do bear with me. I'll do my best. We've seen some great ideas today. I think we're just going to jump straight in with something that's a little bit earlier on in the development stages. I'll introduce us first. My name is Joseph. I'm an ex-petroleum engineer. Over here, we have Olivier, who's going to be presenting with me. He's a global operations specialist at AstraZeneca. We also have Ricardo and Boris over here, and our last team member is in Turkey, Ibrahim. We are Team Evergreen, and we're here today to try and help fill the gap in the sustainability of the global energy landscape. So something I find really interesting about the global energy landscape is that the demand for liquid fuels is actually rising. In the next 20 years, well, in 20 years' time, we'll be burning 121 million barrels of fuel every day to meet our demands. That's 30% of the worldwide energy usage. Now, most of the growth in demand is coming from the transport sector, especially in developing nations or rapidly emerging economies. That is an awful lot of fuel to be burning. And if we want to meaningfully arrest climate change, it can't all be from fossil derivatives. We need low-carbon renewables. Existing popular renewables, like wind and solar, exclusively target the electricity market. So adopting these requires widespread electrification of ground transport. Further, advances in battery technologies are not actually expected to outpace the increasing demand for reliable, energy-dense liquid fuel. As a result of this, electricity is predicted to supply only 1% of the global transport sector by 2040. This graph shows the energy demand in the transport sector and various sources that will help supply it. And you can see that the difference in scale here is absolutely vast. That is the gap that we hope to help fill. This space here represents trillions of dollars in the form of 66 billion barrels of diesel and gasoline fuel that, when burnt, will pollute our environment with 26.5 billion tons of CO2. That shape right there is the gap that we want to make smaller. Okay? So what have we established? What do we know from this? We know that we need to make liquid fuel. All right? We know that most demand is coming out of developing nations, places like Asia, with high urban densities, high populations, growing transport sector. We also know that electricity is not quite ready to supply all of this demand just yet. So how do we bring renewable energies to this space? Let's talk about energy spaces. Okay. Energy spaces is a system that allows individual households to supplement their energy needs with liquid fuel that they produce on their own property. The system itself is a set of panel photobioreactors that are mounted on a rooftop. It's packaged with auxiliary equipment, a digester, a reaction vessel, pump, and the photobioreactors are charged with microalgae. So the microalgae grow using CO2 and sunlight. They make more algae and fatty acids. The fatty acids can be transesterified to produce biodiesel fuel. It's cheap, it's scalable, and it's pretty easy to use, and it allows people to alleviate some of their reliance on fossil fuels. Now, the novelty of energy spaces comes from the fact that it empowers consumers. So it puts the capability to produce liquid fuels in the hands of the end user. It lets them create a fuel that's compatible with a car that they already own. And further, it distributes production capacity across urban areas, using space that's not typically available for this purpose, and it doesn't detract from the original function of that space. All right? It doesn't compete for arable land, and nor does it exclude people from residential areas. Best of all, the fuel it produces when burnt is net carbon neutral. And when compared to solar panels, which quite literally compete for the area, it has an advantage in that it stores energy in a form that's compatible with existing automotive infrastructure. It's fuel that you all recognize straight from your roof right into your car.
All right, I really like your idea. I have so many questions. I'm going to try and cut it down. To two. So the first is the actual model itself on a rooftop, somebody's rooftop. You showed kind of a sloped roof coming off.
Sure.
What's the actual build? Are you talking about a liquid vat with, like a water vat with algae on top?
What we're hoping to do is a closed reactor system. So the cheapest thing we were thinking would be a bag bioreactor. So you could just mount them within a metal frame. I think we had a cost estimate for one of those of about $12 for a bag, just built within a simple frame and hooked onto the roof, basically.
All right, so most homes, most buildings are built to spec to be able to handle the weight of the roof and no additional weight to that. So at the risk of caving in on the homeowner, what's the weight?
Sure. Now, I know we had this discussion. So we don't actually know quite yet whether or not these homes can handle the weight of these reactors. I didn't consider the weight of these reactors. What I can tell you is that the light incidence for growing a microalgal culture optimally actually reduces a lot with depth. So reactors that are going to be optimal for this system are going to be quite thin. I'm hoping, basically, coupled with the bag, that's going to provide a minimal stress to existing buildings. As we expand through markets, we'll also be looking into the building codes to make sure we're compliant with all of the codes in the areas that we'll be building into.
Okay, and a second question around electrification.
Sure.
So I saw the graph up there, but there's a couple things I had a question about around that. Number one is the current pre-order for the Model 3 of Tesla is right around between 400 and 500,000 now, which is more than most car companies sell in an entire fiscal year. Mm-hmm. So the demand is significantly there, at least in the US, for electric vehicles, not to mention countries like Norway and China have policies specifically designed to skew the consumer towards electric vehicles. So I'm not sure I buy into those projections from the DOE. I think they're drastically underestimating what it's going to do to the market.
I mean, I'm working with the predictions from the DOE. I do understand that the demand for electric vehicles is growing, and that's great. We really want electric vehicles, but it seems to be that just the sheer scale of the automotive industry is such that fully electrifying it with even that kind of pre-order. What was the number you said there? How many cars would be in the industry? The pre-order, it was
the pre-order is between 400 and 500,000.
Okay, I mean, in India, there's 80 million cars, just in India. I mean, the percentage of electric vehicles on the road as of December last year was 0.15%. And that's even following these incredible increases that we've seen as electric vehicles make inroads into the market. But just working on those increases, even if they're great multipliers, they're multiplying over initially an extremely small market space. And the energy industry is so well established and so massive that it's going to take a very long time before we can rely upon that to reduce our carbon emissions. So we're trying to fill the gap in between when electricity comes to market really in force.
Two more questions.
Sure.
Just give me a relative sense of the scale. Like if I put one of these units on my house, like how much liquid fuel am I getting in a year? I mean,
That's a great question.
A gallon a month, or you know?
No, it is a great question. I did some back of a napkin yield calculations. It actually came out really, really well. So I think I was a bit too conservative with those numbers. And you can apply as many factors as you want to that, basically. But I would say for you to work in the same kind of vernacular that you're using, probably a tank every 3 weeks, maybe, yeah, about that. Depending on the strain you use, some algal strains actually can have up to 60% of their dry weight represented by fatty acids. Mostly around about 30 or 40 is pretty common, though.
And one other question about the algae you mentioned. Any risk, I mean, if the bag bursts and everything cascades all over the ground?
You're absolutely right. So one of the main things we've considered, we do have a risk assessment that we've done so far. We have a few backup slides here. A couple of things. So we've done a preliminary risk. So we've done
about things.
Yeah, we thought a little bit. So that was one of the major things we and our mentor thought when we arrived. We want to put rapidly replicating microorganisms in the hand of unskilled end users, which I understand is intimidating. So one thing we do as part of our R&D is going to be working on the very, very many layers of protection that are required to go in place to keep these algae from contaminating the environment. I know, Olivia, I mentioned genetic engineering, and I realize that that's something that we haven't talked much about in here, but we think that'd be where the biggest bang for your buck would be in terms of R&D. Because not only would it potentially allow you to increase your yields, it would also allow you to put in things like selection systems that could keep your microalgae in your system, provided you're giving it, like a GS selection system that's used in pharma, I guess, provided you're giving it a certain chemical.
The
if
Jurassic
it's released,
Park
it would
solution,
die.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one.
Does this technology exist today? I mean, is it doable, in a laboratory type scenario? Or?
Absolutely. So this technology is actually really quite well established, and what we're doing is just trying to repackage make it convenient for an end user to
And
have.
do automobiles run off of this sort of energy, or do they
They
have
do.
to have special engine?
No, they do indeed run off this. And actually, you can use this system with a few modifications to produce not only diesel, but also gasoline or biobutanol, which can be used in gasoline engines. The reason we've gone with diesel is because we're targeting a market like India, right? So diesel fuel, I know in a diesel engine you can essentially put vegetable oil in it and it will run. It will smell kind of bad, but it will run. So the diesel fuel that you make from this is like a quick and dirty way to reduce your carbon emissions. But yes, cars
You
currently
don't
run.
have to worry if your algae are 87 octane or 89 or.
No, not really.
And that would mean that the other contaminants other than carbon are also clean coming out of that system?
I beg your
Because
pardon?
diesel has a lot of other contaminants in it other than just the carbon footprint problems.
Not this diesel.
So that was
so-
my question, whether it's clean coming out.
Sure, it is clean. So normally diesel has quite a lot of sulfur in it. You need to clean the sulfur out. Actually, what happens in India, interestingly, is that we take all the sulfur out of the diesel, we sell it to India, and then because India uses engines that require a high lubrication, sulfur is a lubrication element in diesel, sorry, you actually need to sell them separately the sulfur that they can put back in before they put. It's based on the policy of your country, how much sulfur comes out of your tailpipe. But there's not much sulfur embodied in this biofuel at all.
And then I would just, I mean, since you're a little bit early, just kind of quick back of the envelope numbers, at 20 gallons every 3 weeks, that's still roughly 150 plus pounds that you're going to ask somebody, I don't know, if you ask my mother to carry 120 pounds of fuel to pour that into her tank, that's something you're going to have to think about, the storage and how to
A
deliver
usability
that
and
into the
operability
car.
issue? Absolutely, yeah, that's definitely something we'll look into as part of our market research and R&D.
All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.